All right, so now that we just talked about general drawing of characters, so when you have an animation, a big part of your animation for most animations is having a character. Whether that character is Mickey Mouse, Homer Simpson, Fred Flintstone, Peter Griffin, whatever. Having a character that is interesting to watch and, is drawn in a particularly interesting way is a large part of what captivates people and what makes, people want to watch a cartoon and what makes a cartoon successful, animation successful. So here's some just general kind of character design tips to think about. With all of these, they're more suggestions. They're not like you have to follow them, but they're things that people do to get certain effects, you know what I mean? So like I said, there's no magic formula for any character design, but, here are some of the general kind of ideas. What's called form construction, aesthetics, distinction, personality, originality, audience definition, exaggeration, color scheme, and solid drawing. So, form construction is just like, what does the character look like? And I know that sounds kind of obvious, but it's like, does the character, how many arms does the character have? Does it have a big bushy tail? These are things to think about because whatever the character has, that's eventually what you're going to have to animate. So, having an octopus with 8 arms sounds great, but then trying to animate 8 arms is going to be more difficult, trust me. So the more features you give a character, you got to understand that that's also going to be part of what you have to animate. Aesthetics are using pleasing balance between lines and shape. This kind of goes back to lines and that we talked about last module. So it's like, what do the lines look like? Are they thicker lines? Are they thinner lines? Are they more angled? These more angled lines versus more curved lines. How does that affect the balance between the character and, the rest of the scene? So it's like here we have more complicated characters versus the more simplistic green background, right? What stands out with this character? What makes them distinct? So Popeye usually has like the biggest face. He also has this like pipe that's kind of never actually in his mouth. It sort of almost sticks out of his cheek. I never really understood how he does it. But anyway, regardless of how it works, it's kind of what makes it interesting. Color scheme here, like you ever watch an old Roadrunner cartoon? Roadrunner is blue in terms of the color scheme. Cool colors mostly, and then that kind of contrasts against the otherwise much more warm color, kind of orange background. So there's a lot of ways to create distinction. Also, in the Roadrunner cartoons, a lot of things are very angled, and most of the major characters are more rounded. So the Wile E. Coyote character is more rounded, while the rest of it is kind of more angled. These kind of angled lines here. Personality. Personality is an important aspect of your character. Think about like Peter Griffin or Homer Simpson. It's like part of it is the way that they're drawn. Part of it is also things like sound and voice acting, which we'll get to later in the semester. But also part of it is just like what makes the character interesting? What makes it, captivate people? This could be part of the way that its personality and how it speaks or how it behaves, how it moves. Like maybe it has some wacky way of moving that's just like kind of weird. Maybe it's a certain color scheme, or just think about like your favorite character, whatever your favorite character is. What does that character do that makes that character unique, right? Maggie sucks on her pacifier, right? Or Fred Flintstone has a big head that's very angled. This is something that kind of stands out. He wears the leopard skin or, pelt, right? It's kind of a different color than everything else. So what is it that the character does? Also, originality. People like cartoons that have their own quote-unquote feel. In other words, like, if you kind of watch the progression, or not progression, but like the kind of the history of animation, it's like cartoons in different eras have different styles, really. Like you know, here's Popeye. This is like 1930s style. Very like, you know, everything's kind of elongated. Like, you know, everyone's arms are very thin and elongated, right? Compare and contrast that to like the style that Warner Brothers was doing in like the 40s and the 50s with like Bugs Bunny. Things were a lot more cartoony, bigger eyes, you know, things like that. Obviously color, but even that, even if you took Popeye and colorized it, it wouldn't look like Bugs Bunny did, right? And then actually the 60s has its own style with like, you know, you get kind of this Hanna-Barbera style, which is a little more kind of simplistic, I would say, in comparison to the Warner Brothers style. You know, South Park has a certain style. It feels like paper that's been cut out, right? Simpsons has its own style of, you know, usually having very simplified faces. Like there's not really, you know, they never do hair. Like hair is always very simple. You know, there's not a lot of texture, but there's still like a 3D-ness to them, even though they're kind of flatter. This is Super Jail, so you got a lot of like lines and characters that are like more extreme shapes. You know what I mean? You know, things that are exaggerated a lot, like the heads and everything. So like all of these they all have their own style. And when things have their own style, that gives them uniqueness and people like them, right? So Mickey Mouse doesn't really feel like Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty doesn't feel like Ren and Stimpy. Ren and Stimpy doesn't feel like Astro Boy. Like having your own style, I mean, at the beginning, people always like to sort of copy styles that they like. You know, maybe you're a big fan of a particular, you know, Miyazaki style or whatever. But like creating your own style is a good way to sort of have your own feel, you know? Audience definition. What that means is like, you know, and this has a lot to do with what you plan to do with the character, and that kind of relates to the story. But like, who is this character for? What age group? So like, this is Wubbzy, and Wubbzy was designed for like very young kids. So, you know, he's very playful, lots of bright colors, you know, not overly complex in terms of a design. You know, there's not really like texture here. Everything is very simple. Everything's very sort of rounded and soft, right? Compare and contrast that with this. This is like a completely different drawing style. This is much more darker and kind of scary and kind of intense versus something like this, which is a lot more fun, a lot more rounded. So it's like, what is your character going to be doing? And you can play around with that. Like here, it's like, this is not, you know, Super Jail is a very kind of, I don't even want to use the word quirky, but it's very weird. It's different. You know what I mean? It's definitely not meant for kids, and its style is very sort of, I don't want to say ugly, but it's like deliberately trying to be sort of kind of not simple. It's deliberately trying to be complex and be kind of weird, you know? So, you know, once again, you got to figure out what is your character trying to do? Who's it for? Is it for like a moody, dark story, or is it meant for older people who maybe want a more certain style, more gritty or even sexy, depending on the, you know, what your character is meant for, to be honest. Another aspect of character design is exaggeration. So this is what a bunny looks like, right? And you could do out the proportions of a bunny, and it's like there's the head and the ears and the, you know, the torso and the back legs and whatever. And then here's Bugs Bunny, right? So Bugs Bunny doesn't really look like I mean, it has features of a bunny. It has like, you know, fur and ears and whatnot and kind of bigger feet. But it's like, this is much more of an exaggeration. This is actually kind of closer to a human stance than a bunny stance, right? It's not quite 8 heads high or anything, but it's like, here's the head, the ears are much more elongated. It's got almost kind of like these kind of glove-like hands, you know, big old feet. Why did they design Bugs this way? Because it's just more interesting. As I like to kind of say, animation isn't about depicting reality. It's about extending reality. And what I mean by that is, if you want to depict reality, use a camera. That's what a camera is for, right? Whether it's a static camera or a film camera. If you want to have something, you know, animation's about extending reality. Things don't have to look exactly how they would look in real life. So you'll notice in most animations that people have really large heads, right? Bart's head is like, I don't know, like about a third or 2/3, you know, 2/5 of his body. That's way bigger than a normal person's head would be. And that's fine because he's not supposed to mimic a boy, a real life boy. He's an extension of that. And a lot of times, a lot of the expression in a character is going to come from the face, like the eyes and the mouth. So why not exaggerate those? Why not make those bigger and sort of minimize the areas that don't have as much personality, per se? Same thing here. It's like this guy's head is almost like 2/5 of his body. You know what I mean? Most characters, you're not to say all, but most cartoon characters are not typically drawn in perfect 8 heads high. This is another thing here. This is an actual model. This is another one of those sort of showing the proportions of things. This is Beavis from Beavis and Butthead, and it's like, once again, his head is way bigger. His head is about 1/3 of his body, roughly, maybe a little bit bigger. And that, his legs are actually a little foreshortened here. His legs should be a little bit longer in relationship, but the artist decided that's not what they wanted to do there when they came up with the character design for this character. Okay. Another exaggeration is like, exaggerate what helps the character. So like a lot of, it's kind of almost a joke that anime characters have huge eyes, right? Well, eyes are really important to expressing things. So a lot of times, a lot of characters have very large eyes, to get across and large mouths, because your eyes and your mouth are some of the most expressive parts of a character. So you notice most characters have very large eyes and mouths, even in more traditional like Popeye cartoons from the 20s and whatnot. Big mouth, huge eyes. Color schemes, we talked about this a little bit. We might do another module on color, but thinking about what colors do you want for this character? Do you want warm colors? Do you want cool colors? Remember how colors can be used to create contrast. So for instance, if you were trying to draw attention to a part of the character, like their eyes, or like maybe they have a cute bow on their head, maybe you want to use complementary colors like we talked about, colors that would contrast with each other, like red and green or yellow and purple. So it's like, here's a character, right? And it's like you can change the color scheme. The character kind of feels a little different. This character feels a little more sullen. This character feels a little more energetic, and it's the same character. It's just using different colors. So a lot of times in character design, and this happens in all major studios, you'll sit around and think about things like, what colors should I use? Should it be warm color scheme, cool color scheme? What am I trying to get from the colors that I'm using in my project, in my character design? So once again, another example of like, trying different color schemes to see how it feels. Here they took the scales, I guess? I don't know what you'd officially call that, but like kind of using a brighter color versus a darker color here. Here it's a more warmer color. These are more warmer colors, except for maybe the leaves. These are more cooler colors. Here they're playing around a little bit more saturated. These are a little less saturated. We talked about this before, but facial expressions are very important. It's a good way of sort of getting across the emotion of a character. There's kind of an old saying, the eyes are the window of the soul. So it's like, what are the eyes saying? Are they sinister? Are they sort of, I don't want to say sad, but like, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of, laid back, tired. These eyes are obviously excited. And finally, this kind of goes back to final idea is solid drawing. Solid drawing is like this is a 2-dimensional drawing program, right? We're not doing 3D like Pixar would. But that doesn't mean that our character should feel flat. So if I'm drawing a character, let's say I'm going to draw something. Let's make a new layer real quick. And it's like, the character should feel like it's 3-dimensional. You know what I mean? So it's like, there's the head, and the character's kind of like looking this way. And so even though it doesn't feel flat. Flat would feel like, flat would be something like, like this. This feels flat. It doesn't feel like it has a 3rd dimension. But a lot of times you're going to want to draw characters where it's like, okay, here's my character, and then there's the torso. you know, there's the rounded out character. That's not the greatest. Actually, I did that backwards. Should come thicker and then thinner at the end. So this would be an example of like solid drawing where it's like, you know, you're drawing the character. This character feels like it has depth, and you can do this also with color and just body positioning. But it's like the way I'm positioning the body, it's like it feels like the character has depth, even though these are just lines, right? And this can get into perspective drawing and things like that. But it's like you want to draw the character to feel like it has weight and depth. So even in something like this, it's like even this little line here, this kind of gives a little bit of depth to Mickey, or this curved line on the hat. If it was just a flat line, it would feel kind of flat to the camera, but this kind of creates a sense of curve, right? Or even the nose here kind of creates a three-dimensional curve with the relationship to the eyes. Or the position of the ears creates a sense of like, because this feels like it's in between, we get a sense of depth between the ears, okay? So that's what I mean by solid drawing. Solid, you know, and so you can kind of play around with that. A lot of times it's kind of like, you know, think about what direction is your character going to be in, and then how does that relate to the objects you're adding. So, you know, if my character's facing this way, and then, you know, here are the ears, right? So it's like the ears are facing, but then, I don't know, there's the mouse, and then like, there's a tail, but the tail is behind. You know, so it's like you got to figure out where is everything in relationship to each other. That's part of what solid drawing really means. Some more examples. These are what are called model sheets. So you can see like they did, this was a Michigan J Frog. And it's like, you know, they kind of drew the character different poses, and the character definitely feels solid. You know what I mean? Like, it feels, even though it's just a drawing, you can feel a sense of depth by where they place the arms and the legs. Part of it is the posing, you know, straight arm, bent legs, solid upper torso, position of the eyes to the relationship to the mouth. Here's another one for bugs, you know, body positioning, positions of the legs in relationship to each other, face, there's a little bit of a line here, so the face is kind of going in this direction, which is reinforcing that Bugs is facing to the right side. Even like a little bit like that, there's even this little butt thing here is kind of giving Bugs kind of a little bit of a three-dimensional push, you know. Even that little line right there, it's as simple as it is, it creates a sense of depth that this arm is going back and it's over this part of the body.